There's a heck of a lot of birds this morning. Thank you for being with me. Catch this amazing sight. Kind of look like sticks in the water, if you ask me. All the way down, but they're not. They're the cormorants. They will move around for us, I'm sure. It's just beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Alright, it's almost not crooked. I know I'm probably making people slightly nauseous. Nauseated? Is that the right word? Right? There's a difference somehow. Alright, here we are, a minute in. 17 is the chapter that we're on. The book is The Warrior Queens. This chapter is called Iron Ladies. It's the next to the last chapter. Oh my goodness, there goes the birds. We were cut short yesterday due to my phone getting overheated. Oh, the birds are moving again. Alright, so I'm going to go back a little bit. The Discovery, we're on page 302. The Discovery by the feminist poet Judy Grahn, to her own satisfaction, that the name Boadicea, in its original Boudica form, was the origin of the word Boldike, may stand as an extreme example of this. Grahn, in an article of 1980, entitled The Queens of Boldikery, described how in years past the mystery of the word Boldike had burbled and thickened in her mind, deciding that it stemmed from Old English. She therefore searched for a historical people who once worshipped the valued bulls. From here to Boadicea, Bo means cow in Irish, while English friends assured her that bull was pronounced boa, and thence happily to Boudica was a shortened leap of Graham's creative imagination. Boudica was a barbarian and a Celt, wrote Grahn, and her Perdinda would have been active, unashamed, and radiating with female power all her life. Considering Celtic customs, it would have been unnatural of Queen Boudica not to be a lesbian. She was, after all, a queen and a military leader of her people. With an even greater leap of the imagination, Grahn also drew attention to the large number of puns surrounding Boadicea's name, such as the soldiers' dykes, which they made in AD 61, and her statue called Boadicea on the embankment being a synonym for dyke. Grahn, however, derided Dio Cassius' description of the atrocities committed under Boadicea's command. The laceration of the women's breast in particular, as being too much like the typical patriarchal response to women warriors in general to be believed. This point of view, incidentally, provided Grahn with an ally in the shape of Milton. However unlikely the combination, he too dismissed such invented details by which historians hoped to embellish their work. The next leap is to transfer the word Boldike to the United States. Grahn's explanation lies in the slang of Newgate prison, from which many indentured criminals proceeded westwards, a high percentage of them, according to Grand Celts, who remembered their ancestors as homosexual, as a matter of course. It's too easy to dismiss all this as ludicrously unhistorical, which of course it is. For one might observe, with truth, that Grand's imaginative reconstruction is really no more ludicrous than some of the other theories which have been proposed about Boadicea in the past, including, famously, her rich burial at Stonehenge, actually erected nearly 2 millennia before, but believed as an article of faith in the early 17th century, not as Grand's bold lesbian Celt, radiating with feminine powers all her life, necessarily further away from the original than Purcell's meekly apologetic late 17th century princess. My fortune wound my female soul too high and lifted me above myself. Be that as it may, Grand's alluring but fantastical theory has its own importance. For it draws attention to the warrior queen, here epitomized by Boadicea, as a symbol of sexual freedom as well as female independence. At the same time, such an image looks back to the remote past. Grand's poem, written in 1972, She Who, acts as the epigraph of her article. Alright, let me roll this window out because I feel like that wind is totally not cool. There we go. Enough of that. Now here come the birds again. Alright, there they go. Is that how we say words? Okay. She Who acts as the epigraph of her article. I am the wall at the lip of the water. I am the rock that refused to be battered. I am the dike in the matter, the other. And I have been many a wicked grandmother, and I shall be many a wicked daughter. This is once again the language, proud, mystical, and ferocious, of the Ptolemaic creed of Isis, invoked to adorn the image of Cleopatra. I am she that rises in the dog star, she who is called goddess by women. I am the queen of war. I am the queen of the thunderbolt. Liberated sexually in general, not merely homosexuality, contributes to the modern image of the warrior queen. Boadicea, A Tragedy of War, by Robert Reynolds. Issued by the Poets Press in New York in 1941, has a heroine who is seldom mentioned without a reference to her heavy breasts, like pillows, and her frank sexual desires, characteristic of Celtic women. Yet she attracted the younger tribesmen. She was the eternal, fecund woman of their songs and stories and their myths. Henry Treacy's heroine in an English novel of 1958, Red Queen, White Queen, as not only Boadicea but her daughters, Gwynedd and Ciara, all three of them plump and buxom and blonde, sleeping with whoever pleases them in the old fashion. In 1986, a British television program on imaginary women, conducted by Marina Warrener, showed Toyah Willcox, 25-year-old rock singer turned actress and film star, driving a chariot. Her hair, an appropriate modern version of Dio's tawny, was a violent punk red. Toyah Willcox, who had accepted the role of Boadicea, a character I greatly admire, in a film the year before, now described her heroine as a free, liberated, sexual woman. Such a picture of a freewheeling female rebel against patriarchal attitudes may seem in quaint contrast to the statuesque image uninherited from late Victorian times, gravely maternal, deeply imperialist. Yet once again, as in the case of Gran, the idea of the rebel, give or take her sexuality, the true nature of Boadicia's sexuality is one of the many things about her which are likely to remain forever obscure, is of the two the more in keeping with the few known facts of Boadicia's career. There is still a further element in the mythology of Boadicea, which has ensured the survival of interest in her image into modern times. That is the emergence of the political female leader. At first sight, an elected woman, prime minister, may seem to have little in common with a warrior queen of ancient or even more recent times. Yet, there is still an equivocal relationship perceived to exist between women and force, which can rise to a head whenever a woman is voted into power, or even, significantly in modern democracies, might be voted into power. Or even, significantly in modern democracies, might be voted into power. Yet there is still an equivocal relationship perceived to exist between women and force, which can rise to a head whenever a woman is voted into power, or even might be voted into power. This equivocal relationship brings the notion of Boadicea, or some other legendary warrior queen, into play once more. In the suffragette pageant of 1909, prejudice had claimed force for man alone. On the grounds that woman traditionally cowered away from the white glint of the sword. He also claimed force as the last and ultimate judge, effectively debarring timorous women from the exercise of power. Or in general, de Gaulle's nobler version of the same sentiment, quoted in Chapter 1, force was described as watching over civilization and ruling empires. The fighting spirit began being an integral part of man's inheritance. On the stage in 1909, prejudice had been easily routed by the appearance of the defiant Boadicea, epitomizing women's ability to handle any martial matter. But the reality was very different and remains so. The question of what Kleist in Penthesilea called fate's iron tongue, the sword, will not go away. Can women, if voted into power, handle the great issues of war and death and peace? Are they not too tender, if not actually too timid? Female leaders of the second half of the 20th century have conspicuously found themselves having to prove their credentials in this respect by one means or another. Not only after election, but during the process leading up to it, Geraldine Ferraro was the Democratic vice presidential candidate in the United States presidential election of 1984. The first woman to figure in such an outstanding position. And at the time of writing, which is 1988, the year of the next round of presidential elections, the only one. They're all flying back out. Okay. Her account of her experiences campaigning, as related in my story, published in 1986, makes illuminating reading, where it shows clearly that deep, primitive fears of women's potential, timidity or weakness, lurked in certain quarters of her country. Nothing in the political development of women elsewhere, or even in America's own vigorous women's movement, had affected this. Such fears were not exactly nursed in secret. In her confrontation on nationwide television with her opposite number, the sitting Republican Vice President George Bush, on the 11th of October, 1984, Geraldine Ferraro described herself facing the final and inevitable question. Thus, Vice President Bush, Congresswoman Ferraro, would you have had little or no experience in military matters, and yet you might someday find yourself Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces? How can you convince the American people and the potential enemy that you would know what to do to protect this nation's security? Do you think in any way that the Soviets might be tempted to try to take advantage of you simply because you are a woman? This question was posed incidentally 5 years after Mrs. Thatcher had become Prime Minister of Great Britain. Hardly a good example of a woman of whom the Soviets had successfully taken any advantage. I didn't hesitate, wrote Geraldine Ferraro. Are you saying that I would have to have fought in a war in order to love peace? I shot back. And she did, of course, assure the questioner of her confidence in her own ability to handle such a situation. But she admitted that it was a terribly important question, and I had thought a great deal about how to answer it. George Bush, for his part, emphasized his own combat experience in the Second World War, for which Geraldine Ferraro, born in 1934, would of course have been too young, quite apart from her gender. Yes, I did serve in combat. I was shot down when I was a young kid, scared to death, and all that heightened my convictions about peace. Marvin Kalb on Meet the Press put the question to Geraldine Ferraro in an even simpler form. Are you strong enough to push the button? Another legitimate question. No candidates. Two candidates of both sexes might be. Are you strong enough not to push the button? But this was not posed. Although Geraldine Ferraro gave the obvious reply that she could do whatever was necessary for the protection of her country. Privately, she found it endlessly annoying to be presumed weak and indecisive just because she was a woman. There was a bigger underlying issue of her candidacy was really being judged on the same level as a man's. She would hardly be asked to answer questions like that. Nor, indeed, was this question asked of any other candidates other than members of Congress who were religious ministers. But of course, Geraldine Ferraro's candidacy, in the event unsuccessful, since the election was won by the Republicans in a landslide, was not being judged on the same level as a man's. And those elected female leaders who have emerged triumphant have needed to pull the mantle of the warrior queen about them where appropriate, and use it to lend further mythic authority to the role of mere prime minister. Sex has had to be made a subtle advantage instead of a crude disadvantage. Indira Gandhi became Prime Minister of India on 24th January 1966, at the age of 48. She was not, in fact, the first woman in the world to occupy the position. That honor had already gone to Mrs. Gandhi's contemporary, Sirimavo Bandaranaike of Sri Lanka, who was elected in July 1960. Interestingly enough, after their inception, the careers of both Mrs. Gandhi and Mrs. Bandaranaike indicate that the appendage syndrome, common to so many warrior queens, continued to operate under elective conditions as it had done under the hereditary system in the past. That is to say, although the London Evening News wrote concerning Mrs. Bandaranaike of the need for a new word, presumably we shall have to call her a stateswoman. The comment of the News Chronicle was considerably more apt. Gentle widow heads for job as premier. For Mrs. Bandaranaike, Rani Like was the widow of the veteran Sri Lankan statesman Solomon W. R. D. Bandaranaike, 18 years her senior, who had acted as premier for 3.5 years before he was assassinated in 1959 by a Buddhist monk. An inclusive political election the following March was followed by an invitation to Mrs. Bandaranaike to head the government. She was the symbol the figurehead that was necessary, the spark to ignite the flame. In the words of her biographer, there is an obvious modern comparison to be made with Mrs. Corazon Aquino, grieving widow of an assassinated opposition Filipino leader, whose symbolic presence heading a political party at a time when her remarkable personal qualities were largely unknown, provided the spark to sweep away President Marcos in 1986. As for Indira Gandhi, coming from a Kashmiri Brahmin family, the only child of Pandit Nehru, she could, in a sense, be said to have been born to rule, a princess who inherited from her parent, as Matilda of Tuscany inherited from her father, Boniface II, or Tamara of Georgia from George III. Prior to her election, Indira Gandhi, the shy child of a brilliant father, absent much of her childhood in prison, and of an uneducated mother of lower social standing, had indeed held only one political position. She had been president of the Congress Party in 1959, but resigned after less than a year in favor of her maternal duties. Indira Gandhi actually became prime minister when Lal Bahadur Shastri died suddenly in office of a heart attack. In this uneasy situation, it was a symbol of that same continuity which Queen Elizabeth I constantly sought to establish, with references to her sire, Great Harry, that the crowds in 1966 shouted not only Indira Kai Jai, long live Indira, but also Jawaharlal Kai Jai, long live Nehru. Mrs. Gandhi, the beneficiary of the appendage syndrome, quickly became part of another familiar syndrome, that of the better man. In her first year of office, for example, she was described as the only man in the cabinet of old women. She also received much of the same heroic treatment concerning her youth from her admiring biographers, as well as herself stressing such early heroic self-identifications in what was surely a calculated manner. An earlier girlhood identification, with Joan of Arc, for example, is frequently mentioned even by her family, and confirmed by Mrs. Gandhi herself in a letter to her lifelong friend Dorothy Norman. She was a great heroine of mine, one of the first people I read about with enthusiasm. In other interviews, as with the celebrated Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, Mrs. Gandhi underlined a tomboy past. She revealed that her very doll play had been militarily oriented. I had many dolls, and I played with them, not necessarily seeing them as babies to feed. In fact, I used them as men and women to perform insurrections, battles, and so on. Oh, that's funny. You see, I didn't have any Barbies either. So that's not entirely true. I had 2 Barbies, but they were broken. I had a Cher Barbie, and she did not have an arm. And then I had a blonde Barbie, and it did not have a leg. So it isn't that I didn't have Barbies. Yes, I'm moving this around because the birds moved. Well, I'm having a little personal story here. I decided to try to readjust us. These things are so wordy. I don't know if I can keep going for as long as my normal stuff does, because I'm kind of like worded out. You know, like, there's no more words. There's where all those birds went, y'all. Can you see them? And due to my... Yeah, it's getting hot. That's what they look like all out there in the whoa. Alright, let's try another minute or two. Let's see if we can get a little further. I didn't mean to get distracted there, friends. Actually, it's very, very hot. Okay. Let's see if I can remember where it was. So I guess my point is the Barbies I had were already wounded warriors. I've had as wounded warriors to play with. I didn't have anything that wasn't broken. I had brothers. And let me tell you, there's plenty of army training and military training with 4 brothers. That makes me laugh. Oh, she didn't have dolls either. It's not just a me thing. Okay, here we go. I continue forward. I had many dolls, and I played with them, not necessarily seeing them as babies to feed. In fact, I used them as men and women to perform insurrections, battles, and so on. She told a would-be biographer that sometimes her dolls were arranged to perform a struggle between the Satyagrahis and the police, and the bridegroom doll playing the Satyagrahi leader, while the little Indira shouted slogans such as Mahatma Gandhi Kai Jai. Mrs. Gandhi's male, aggressive role was, by her own account, encouraged by her mother, who had resented the constrictions on her own life, as well as by her father. I was brought up as a boy when I was small. I climbed trees, I ran, and I never had any feelings of inferiority or weaknesses. Excuse me, Lord. It was politically adroit of Mrs. Gandhi, faced with the problems of being a woman premier in a country which was 83% Hindu, to hint at the honorary male in such statements about herself. Officially, however, she took a slightly different stance. As Prime Minister, I am not a woman. I am a human being. Although her confidence to Dorothy Norman, I am in no sense a feminist, but I believe in women being able to do everything, may have come nearer to representing her real feelings on this complicated subject. Again, she stated, I do not regard myself as a woman, but as a person with a job to do. Golda Meir's version of this, incidentally, when asked how it felt to be a female foreign minister, was to crack back. I don't know. I've never been a male foreign minister. A short biography of Mrs. Gandhi for young boys and girls by R. Sundara Raju, published in New Delhi in 1980, begins with the prophecy of a dying old man, Sarojini Naidu, at her birth, that she would be the nightingale, the new soul of India. Later, Indira Gandhi declared that being a woman has neither helped nor hindered me. During the struggle for independence, nobody was concerned about being beaten up or shot at or anything. Nobody said, "This is a woman and we won't shoot. It would be unfair if," later on, this question were to crop up. Yet, since inevitably it did crop up and would always do so, Mrs. Gandhi also employed that other expedient of the warrior queen, by which she was made a virtue of necessity with wonderful dexterity. That is to say, she assumed the role, even the title, of the mother, so deeply embedded in the Hindu consciousness, with the aura of those goddesses bright and dark, Durga and Kali, rulers of fertility and destruction, hovering about her. History, or folk memories of history, as described in chapter 16, with regard to the Rani of Jhansi, could be said to be on her side, to make of her, in the minds of the less educated, the last in a long line of queens and empresses, rather than the first woman prime minister. Moreover, in 1966, Mrs. Gandhi possessed, to the simple mind, the hopeful, imperial quality of being the mother of sons. Rajiv Gandhi, later Prime Minister of India, in his turn after his mother's assassination in 1986, was 22 at the time. One remembers Isabella of Spain, bolstered up in authority by the birth of an heir during the Civil War. It was, however, war, the successful Indian War against Pakistan of 1971, which gave Mrs. Gandhi her ultimate prestige and also her ultimate kind of deification, as Durga on the one hand, an imposing leader of her country on the other. Afterwards, as Dom Moraes wrote, she had achieved the status of a myth. She was Joan of Arc, without the inconvenience of prison, fire, and cross. It was not a war of Mrs. Gandhi's seeking. In fact, it can be argued that the female premiers of the 20th century, like the 18th and 19th century queens regent, have not been of their nature belligerent, merely determined to do their belligerent best in war when it comes, that is to say, to be as good as men, if not better. Yet following the first Pakistani air raids against India in December 1971, no one could ever again ask, in India at least, how will this woman react in a crisis? Will she be too timid, or if not too timid, too tender? Goldamir, born in 1898, and thus nearly 20 years older than Indira Gandhi, became Prime Minister of Israel in 1969, having served as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1956 to 1965. She had previously been the first Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union and Minister of Labor, and would also serve as Secretary General of the Labour Party. Early in her career, Golda Meir had also shown herself capable of oratory on the imagined Bodhisattva scale. On the 21st of January in 1948, She spoke eloquently to the Council of Jewish Federations in Chicago, appealing for funds without which the future state could not survive. It was a speech subsequently praised by the first premier of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. Someday, when history will be written, it will be said that there was a Jewish woman who got the money which made the state possible. To British ears, at least, it has a Churchillian ring. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the Yishuv in Palestine will fight in the Negev, and will fight in Galilee, and will fight on the outskirts of Jerusalem till the very end. You cannot decide whether we should fight or not. We will. You can only decide one thing, whether we shall be victorious in this fight or whether the Mufti will be victorious. That decision American Jews can make. It has to be made quickly, within hours, within days. Golda Meir returned to Palestine with promises of $50 million. As with Mrs. Ben-Derecki, the choice of Mrs. Meir was intended to be a healing one. In view of the rival claims of Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon. And once again, Mrs. Meir's elevation followed an unexpected death, that of the premier Levi Eshkol. Otherwise, there was one very important difference. Here at last was a female leader who owed nothing to the appendage syndrome, one who was neither the daughter or widow of a famous man, nor the regent mother for some form of infant princeling. To secure her place without the benefit of any specific male connection was in itself a remarkable achievement on the part of Golda Meir, and one far rarer in the history of women than is generally supposed. One can appreciate the judgment of Mrs. Meir's political advisor, Simcha Dinitz, later Director General of the Prime Minister's Office and Ambassador to Washington in 1973 to 1978, that she had the best qualities of a woman: intuition, insight, sensitivity, compassion, plus the best qualities of a man: strength, determination, practicality, purposefulness. Nevertheless, for all the self-made quality of her position, the kind of questions, sometimes innocent, sometimes not, which Mrs. Meir faced concerning the implications of her reaching high office, has as ever a familiar ring. In My Life, published in 1975, Golda Meir described a visit to the National Press Club in Washington when she was foreign minister. There were only two queries that were at the new. The first concealed Israel's intention, or otherwise, to employ nuclear weapons if its survival was in jeopardy. The second went as follows: Mrs. Meir, your grandson Gideon says you make the best gefilte fish in the world. Would you reveal your recipe to us? This was naive behavior at worst, and it made Mrs. Meir laugh at the time. On the other hand, the Jordanian newspaper, which mocked Mrs. Meir in 1969 for asking for negotiations before war as a grandmother telling bedtime stories to her— she was indeed a grandmother at this point, not surprisingly, for a woman in her early 70s, was not naive, but calculating. Once again, it is impossible to envisage a male leader being subject to this particular diatribe, and yet the ambiguity at the center of the whole subject of the warrior queen remains. Mrs. Mere also derived strength, surely, from her grandmotherly image, not least among her own strongly matriarchal people. It was, after all, perfectly possible that the president of the Washington Press Club genuinely wanted that recipe and admired Mrs. Mere for her alleged skills. Months later in Los Angeles, when she answered a question on television about her chicken soup, 40,000 people wrote in for the recipe. That juxtaposition of Israel's survival with a recipe would have been evinced only by the sight of a woman minister. And there was indeed something matriarchal, grandmotherly even, about the way she ran her government. To quote Chaim Herzog, later president of Israel, another who knew her well and worked under her, Golda Meir had a particular style of government in which her personality was the deciding factor, and that personality was very much that of the overbearing mother who ruled the roost with her iron hand. This was not always, in his opinion, to the benefit of her government. With little idea of orderly administration, she preferred to work closely with cronies in an ad hoc framework that soon came to be known as her kitchen, so named for good reason, since Golda Meir was wont to make coffee and tea there for her associates throughout the long night hours, as well as making coffee at 4 a.m. for her guards. At the same time, one might most easily rebut the Jordanian sneer by observing that in the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, the War of Atonement, the grandmother acquitted herself both gallantly and expertly. To quote Chaim Herzog again on her conduct during the war, on many occasions, Golda Meir, a woman who had reached 75, found herself thrust into a position where she had to decide between differing military options proposed by professionals. She decided, and invariably decided well, drawing on a large measure of common sense, which had stood her in good stead. Her stubborn decisiveness proved a national asset during the war, even if her doctrinaire approach to problems and to the operation of government contributed to the failings of that government before it. And then there was the special rapport which Golda Meir had with the ordinary soldiers of Israel, something bringing her close to Isabella of Spain or Tamara of Georgia. When Golda Meir wept at the Wailing Wall on the 5th day of the 6-day war for the sacrifices of Israel's youth, the soldiers watched her and wept too. There is, however, one 20th century female political leader who has had to be extremely cautious at any overt suggestion of queenship, warrior or otherwise. That is not to say that the subject in all its emotive strength does not arise. Margaret Thatcher, then aged 53, became Prime Minister of Great Britain in May 1979, the first woman to occupy the position, as 5 years earlier she had been the first woman to lead any British political party. By this date, Queen Elizabeth II, a mere 6 months younger than the new Prime Minister, had already been on the throne for over 27 years. This nation loves a monarch. A committee of the House of Commons had advised Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell in 1657, suggesting that he should regularize his position by accepting a crown himself. In the words of Secretary Thurlow, advocating the same course. It's the office which is known to the laws and this people. They know their duty to a king and his to them. Certainly the British love their monarchy, and certainly they love their present monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, who regularly tops polls as the most admired British woman. They also know their duty to her, just as she knows hers to them. The Queen's conspicuous sense of duty being among the qualities which have endeared her to her subjects in the course of a reign whose span in 1988 is already approaching that of her illustrious predecessor, the First Elizabeth. It is Queen Elizabeth II who enacts the role of the holy, armed figurehead to her people in her frequent ceremonial appearances at military parades, naval reviews, and so forth, of which her presence for many years in uniform and on horseback at the trooping of the color is probably the best known. Five pages left. Let's get a little tiny bit further. Under the circumstances, one can understand the alarm, both public and private, which Miss Thatcher has displayed at any suggestion of encroachment on the royal role on her own part. She is obviously well aware of the resentment she might unleash. You don't do that to me, my dear. I'm only in politics, she observed hastily to an unwary Spanish tourist who curtsied to her when the Prime Minister was glimpsed on a shopping tour in 1987. You don't do that to me, my dear. I'm only in politics. Oh, that's cute. But once again, the issue is not so simple. The existence of Queen's Regent in British history and the tradition of national prosperity under two of them, the long-reigning Elizabeth I and Victoria, means that every British school child, the one who knows about the knives on the wheels of Boadicea's chariot, also knows that it is not out of the question for a woman to rule Britain. Much as Mrs. Gandhi benefited from Hindu traditions of powerful women in religion, literature, and history, despite the theoretically inferior position of women in Hindu society. In January 1988, when Mrs. Thatcher became the longest-serving Prime Minister in 20th century Britain, There was a plethora of commentaries and comparisons. But after lip service had been paid to Prime Minister Asquith, whose record she had just beaten, the main comparisons were made unashamedly to British reigning queens. As Robert Harris wrote rather despairingly in The Observer, it is not sexist to use a regal analogy to describe her impact on the country. It is not particularly fastidious. It is simply the nearest thing we have to a historical parallel. Lord Hailsham, Lord Chancellor, in Mrs. Thatcher's government for 8 years, openly described his premier as being in the same category as Mary Tudor, Elizabeth I, Queen Anne, and Queen Victoria, favoring Elizabeth I especially in her handling of men. So Mrs. Thatcher, without visibly seeking it, rather to the contrary, did benefit from the tradition expressed long ago by Tacitus concerning the Bretons and Boadicea. They did not discriminate against women in matters of command. There is a kind of justice in this, for Mrs. Thatcher also had to contend with many of those problems special to the warrior queen, or queen regent, which have been mentioned throughout this book. The female voice of command, which grates on the male ear for reasons which are as much psychological as physiological, is one of these problems from Boadicea's allegedly harsh voice onwards. The disadvantage to Miss Thatcher of her female, lightly timbered voice in a massively male-dominated House of Commons, which means, of course, deep male voice dominated, is not one to be dismissed lightly, since it has entailed exactly that kind of screeching in making herself heard most disliked by men and many women. Mrs. Thatcher has acknowledged this herself. "Yes, I do have to shout to make myself heard," she admitted in an interview in 1986. "And sometimes I say, I am not going to shout any more like I did last time. I will just stand there until they are quiet." In the same year, the Labour Shadow Minister, Gerald Kaufman, drew attention to what he called Mrs. Thatcher's fishwife act in the House of Commons. Screaming away in a shrill, strident voice with her face absolutely contorted. The Liberal leader, David Steele, made the same point and independently used the same epithet. "I don't personally like her House of Commons style. I don't think that's the fishwife approach. Is it all effective or impressive?" It was, however, in vain that Kaufman hoped his own comment was made in an unsexist way. For the point is indeed a sexist one, whether intended as such or not, in that no man could possibly be subject to the same criticism. One cannot help recalling Leonardo Bruno's Quattrocento advice to Battista Malatesta about a woman who increases the volume of her speech with greater forcefulness. She will appear threateningly insane and requiring restraint. A man bellowing to make himself heard in the House of Commons, as many men do, does not sound either to his own side or to his opponents like a fishwife, that traditional English misogynistic term of abuse going back to the 14th century, let alone as though requiring restraint. There is no obvious solution to this particular problem of the female leader's voice, except, of course, more women members of Parliament. After the 1987 general election, there were 41 women to 609 men. But another lingering problem, a problem which will not go away, to judge from Geraldine Ferraro's experience. How resolute can a female leader be, expected to show herself against a nation's enemies? Was solved for Mrs. Thatcher from an unexpected quarter, the Soviet Union. Ironically enough, the most likely candidate at the time for the title of Britain's enemy. In January of 1976, just under a year after she had been elected leader of the Conservative Party, Mrs. Thatcher made a major speech in London, which described the Soviet Union as a serious threat, both military and political, to which threat it was vital that the West should respond with strength and confidence. It was the Soviet Union's response, attacking her as the Iron Lady in Red Star, the official journal of the Red Army, which presented Mrs. Thatcher with what rapidly became, for good tactical reasons, her favorite sobriquet. It was immediately given wide prominence, not only in the Western press, but by the victorious victim herself. "I have the reputation of being the Iron Lady," she would say on U.S. television, at the time of the Falklands War. "I have great resolve." A cartoon in the Daily Express of her visit to the United States on this occasion showed Mrs. Thatcher as Boadicea, long sword raised, iron breastplates prominent, with President Reagan at her chariot wheels in a cowboy hat. Even if Mrs. Thatcher had been variously dubbed Iron Maiden and Iron Lady by Marjorie Proops in the London Daily Mirror as early as 1973, it was the Soviet Union's adoption, or spontaneous invention, of the phrase which gave it exactly the endorsement which Miss Thatcher needed to emerge as a warrior queen. At any rate, in the estimation of Britain's enemies, as Bruce Arnold wrote in a hostile work, Margaret Thatcher, A Study in Power, published in 1984, that memorable line, "The female of the species is more deadly than the male," acts as the epigraph. Mrs. Thatcher's baptism as the Iron Lady effectively created the political reputation on international affairs which, by their dismissal, her labor opponents had denied her up to that point. The Iron Lady of the Western world, me, a cold warrior. She was able to repostate publicly. Well, yes, if that is how they, the Russians, wish to interpret my defense of values and freedoms fundamental to our way of life. helicopter went by and made us good times. What propaganda had so felicitously, from Mrs. Thatcher's point of view, begun, war itself was to confirm. Certainly the fact that the Falklands campaign would be the crucible of Miss Thatcher's reputation as a leader was appreciated in advance. In the House of Commons, in the opening debate following the Argentinian invasion on the 3rd of April in 1982, Enoch Powell, no longer a member of the Conservative Party, actually referred to the phrase Iron Lady in order to add, "In your next week or two, this House, the nation and the right honorable lady herself will learn of what metal she is made." It is said that Mrs. Thatcher nodded her head in agreement. Another observer of the political spectrum, hostile to Mrs. Thatcher, Anthony Barnett, author of Iron Britannia, Why Parliament Waged Its Falklands War. An epigraph this time was merely the biblical name Judith in heavy black type. Wrote cogently that Mrs. Thatcher remained a misfit until the 3rd of April debate elevated her into the war leader of a bipartisan consensus. An important inside testimony, on the other hand, is that of Patrick Cosgrove, the author of 3 successive biographical studies of Mrs. Thatcher, since he worked for her as her special advisor for 4 years. In 1985, Cosgrove wrote that not only did the period between 2 of April, 14 of June, 1982, show the Prime Minister at her most typically daring and resolute, but the war in the South Atlantic will undoubtedly be seen in the future, as it was at the time, as bearing witness to Margaret Thatcher as most truly herself. As a result, the British campaign in the South Atlantic to recover the Falklands Islands from the Argentine invaders saw Mrs. Thatcher's personal popularity as a leader jump from 36% approval in March of 1982 to 59% after the war. Staggering leap. There can be no starker illustration of the continuing potency of the image of the warrior queen in a nation's consciousness. As for the armed forces themselves and the men who lead them, they have been described as responding to her as a war leader in a way that hasn't been known since the time of Elizabeth I, with a passion and a loyalty that few male generals have ever inspired or commanded. For the army, at least, Mrs. Thatcher has begun to have her own manna as a goddess, an apparition transcending that of the armed figurehead, for example, holy or otherwise, because of its sheer personal strength. It was suggested by Selina Hastings in the Sunday Telegraph that in view of the aphrodisiac pull of power itself for the armed forces, she is far and away the favorite object of sexual fantasy. Equally for those of whom power is not necessarily thrilling, Mrs. Thatcher being the most powerful woman in the world, she sometimes seems like Kali, the grim Indian goddess of destruction, as she ruthlessly demolishes old ideas, policies, and personalities, while at the same time exercising her other talents as the great creative stateswoman, the Blessed Marguerite. This remarkable double-headed comparison to the goddess destroyer on the one hand, and the sainted female, was that of the historian and political journalist Paul Johnson on the eve of the Conservative Party conference in 1987. He warned discontented Tories, "Don't get caught under the wheels of this juggernaut. Blessed Margaret, the creative radical, is driving it, but Callie Thatcher, the destroyer, is at hand, if required." Opinions vary about what use Mrs. Thatcher has actually made of her own unavoidable femininity, consciously or unconsciously, and what difference the whole intricate topic has made to her premiership. Commentators of both sexes and all shades of political opinion have gazed at her with fascinated awe, some seeing in Mrs. Thatcher that Medusa on the snaky-headed Gorgon shield wielded by wise Minerva, which froze her foes to stone. Others viewing her with more admiration as wise Minerva herself, whose own rigid looks of chaste austerity and noble grace, as Milton pointed out in Comus, were enough to dash brute violence without need of any Gorgon shield. But there has been remarkable unanimity among commentators and biographers that it has made some difference. Hugo Young and Annie Sloman, for example, in The Thatcher Phenomenon of 1986, agreed that her style of leadership turns heavily on her being a woman, without being sure how. While the independent-minded Conservative MP Julian Critchley described her as deploying her feminine qualities like artillery pieces, one biographer summed it up more ambivalently thus: "She has played the matter of being a woman, and that of woman's place in modern society, in a variety of not always very clear-cut ways. The explanation for this lack of clear-cutness lies surely in Mrs. Thatcher's own intuition concerning her situation, as she brilliantly, instinctively, as the brilliantly instinctive politician she undoubtedly is. Mrs. Thatcher has realized, either consciously or unconsciously, the effect is the same, that if the issue were to be clear-cut, it would be to rob her of a great deal of support on the one hand, a good deal of maneuverability on the other hand. On the one hand, she has played the role of the honorary male, with all the aplomb of Queen Elizabeth I, as when in 1979, on a visit to Northern Ireland, following the murder of Lord Mountbatten and a number of British soldiers, Mrs. Thatcher adopted the red beret and flak jacket of the Parachute Regiment, thus pleasing the regiment itself, but not the Northern Ireland office. This can be directly compared to Queen Elizabeth I's choice of a silver cuirass and plumed helmet for her appearance at Tilbury, since neither lady actually intended to take to the battlefield There have been numerous other carefully organized sightings of Mrs. Thatcher in military situations, particularly in the early days of her premiership, where her symbolic presence as a warrior queen was hard to miss. Like Queen Elizabeth again, Mrs. Thatcher had displayed another interesting characteristic of the monarchy. Like Queen Elizabeth again, Mrs. Thatcher had displayed another interesting characteristic of the honorary male. She had no visible preference for the advancement of her own sex. After 9 years of Mrs. Thatcher's premiership, only one other woman had been appointed to the cabinet, and she, incidentally, a member of the non-competitive House of Lords, not Commons. Baroness Janet Young's 2-year stint in her capacity as leader of the House of Lords included the period of the Falklands War, a fact which Mrs. Thatcher either had temporarily forgotten or chose grandly to ignore when she told her cabinet on the 2nd of April of 1982, "Gentlemen, we shall have to fight." It ended when Baroness Young was demoted to a minor role in the government outside the cabinet. It has been precipitantly observed that the presence of another woman in the cabinet photograph spoils the radiance which the leader alone possesses in photographic terms, making her so clearly unmistakable in her visible female dress. At some very primitive level, did Mrs. Thatcher resent Baroness Young's presence? For there is the element of chivalry, which the woman in a man's world traditionally evokes. An honorary male, perhaps, but not sacrificing any of the prerequisites allowed by society to the female. At Mrs. Thatcher's first party conference as Conservative leader in October of 1975, Barbara Castle, a prominent Labour politician in the Wilson government, who had yet to see her own party elect a female leader, confided to her diary, possibly not without a small jealous pang, that Mrs. Thatcher now displayed a special bloom produced by the vitamin of power. In March, she had written, "Margaret's election has stirred up her own inside wonderfully. All her backbenchers performed like knights, jousting a tourney for a lady's favors, showing off their paces by making an unholy row at every opportunity over everything that the Labour government does." 13 years later, the official photograph to commemorate Mrs. Thatcher's long-serving record certainly did give her a remarkable air of a Tudor sovereign in her long gold brocade dress, surrounded by males, including cabinet ministers, top civil servants, and her own husband, 26 black and white dinner-jacketed knights. Then there is Mrs. Thatcher's celebrated reaction to a question concerning women's liberation at her first press conference as Conservative leader. "What's it ever done for me?" Queen Victoria, among past female rulers, might have approved of this disdain, with her well-known antipathy toward women's rights in principle and professional women in practice. But in her own time, such contempt has earned Mrs. Thatcher the justified dislike and disapproval of the women's movement. An editorial of August 1982 in Spare Rib, a leading feminist magazine, criticized the way masculinity has been propagated throughout the whole Falklands crisis. Military and sexual powers mixed up together as glorious, most notably by the female prime minister. We are not saying women should avoid positions of power, but that unless we direct our efforts to the good of all women, we are likely to promote rather than challenge the current notions of masculinity. In short, there is the very real danger of leading to more Margaret Thatchers. On the other hand, with Mrs. Thatcher's denial of any specifically female qualities, has gone an ability to capitalize on them where necessary. Once again, probably successful just because it is instinctive. One has to admit that even her reaction to women's liberation may, fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon one's view of the subject, have gained her far more support than she lost in Britain in 1975. Nor can Mrs. Thatcher fairly be blamed for capitalizing on her sex, since she has had to suffer a good many slings and arrows on the subject from the very first moment when Labour supporters shouted, "Ditch the bitch," until honorably restrained by women members of the Labour movement. During the Falklands campaign, insults in the Argentinian press varied from chicken brain, because she was a woman, to go back to knitting and stay in the kitchen. Although such outbursts were smoothly dismissed by President Galtieri of Argentina in an interview once more with Ariana Falci, on the grounds that humor and caricature belong to the Latin temperament. The area of attack chosen was surely significant. Now, nor was the kitchen reference confined to the Latin temperament. The puppet Iron Lady, as depicted by Luck and Flaw, the British cartoonists, on television in November of 1976, had her breastplate and armor created out of colanders and other pieces of kitchen equipment. I think I remember seeing that one. Under the circumstances, Mrs. Thatcher was well entitled to use that metaphorical knitting needle, to which she was told to return, as an offensive weapon. As early as 1979, on the eve of her first general election as Conservative leader, Mrs. Thatcher emphasized the practical value of her female domesticity. "I know what it is to run a home and a job," and quoted the recent examples of Golda Meir for authority. That characteristic technique, the female leader, through history, back to Zenobia, stressing her descent from Cleopatra. In an important and prominent interview with George Gale in the Daily Express, shortly after the Falklands War was over, Mrs. Thatcher directly compared the running of the campaign to household management. Excuse me. All right, guys, we have like one page of this chapter left and then one chapter of this book left. I know this is running long, but look at those birds. Aren't they just precious? Beautiful. But if I zoom in, they get blurry, and I'm going to assume that it's going to be on a TV that you watch it like I do. And then, oh, there's my my friends. Oh, finally a brief speck of sun. All right. One page left. Friends and family. Hang on. Mrs. Thatcher directly compared the running of the campaign to household management, something on which she, as a woman, could be presumed to be an expert, or at least by implication more expert than the men surrounding her. This was in answer to the question, did being a woman make any difference? It may just be that many, many, many women make naturally good managers and organizers. You might not think of it that way, George, she went on sweetly. But each woman who runs a house is a manager and an organizer. We thought forward each day, and we did it in a routine way, and we were on the job 24 hours a day. Mrs. Thatcher's reaction to George Gale's next topic is, however, a perfect illustration of the kind of maneuverability she has always allowed herself. Was it difficult for a woman to issue orders involving blood being shed? He asked. We were thinking in terms of saving lives, she answered, without directly replying to the question. But bearing in mind that our people had been invaded by a pretty awful dictatorship, one lived with the agony of the troops who were going down on the supply line on ships. One lived with the agony of the soldiers. But we didn't look only at the agony, we also looked at the professionalism, the loyalty, and the devotion of our troops. In a trice, the cozy, super feminine housekeeper has become the dedicated warrior queen, a singular exception. In Gibbon's phrase, the woman ruling proudly in the man's world. So, Boadicea marches on in her third modern personification. Not the abstract, patriotic symbol of empire. Not the independent woman, free of shackles, which may be political or sexual. But the elected, female prime minister and occasional war leader, whose existence continues to enrage, fascinate, and inspire in equal quantities, beyond any capacity of her male contemporaries to do these same three things. The innumerable allusions and comparisons to Boadicea during Miss Thatcher's premiership, far from being monolithically favorable in intention or unfavorable, in fact, illustrate just this many-sided aspect of her own image, as well as that of Boadicea herself. At the time of the Falklands campaign, the left-wing New Statesman, in a critical editorial, called Mrs. Thatcher this Boadicea, who would have to come back into the real world when the war was over. Adam Raphael, in The Observer, also called her Boadicea at roughly the same date, late May. Every time she opens her mouth, she castrates one of her ministers. When the action was over, however, she would need to pipe down. In 1985, however, Woman's Own magazine interviewed a lady who had just been voted the most feminine woman of the year for believing that a woman's place is not in the office, but to stay at home having babies. The happy winner also professed herself a great admirer of Mrs. Thatcher. When it was pointed out that this was a contradiction, in view of Mrs. Thatcher's manifest career as Prime Minister, the most feminine woman was at first nonplussed. Then she took refuge in a safe, historical comparison. Well, ideally, she shouldn't be there in office, but she is an extremely exceptional woman, and the exceptions will always find their way to the top. Look at Boadicea. The most potent image is a visual one, that of the cartoonist Gale in the Daily Telegraph, the foremost newspaper of conservative sympathies. On polling day, 11 June 1987. Mrs. Thatcher is seen dressed as Boadicea, late 20th century version, in a Celtic robe, but with pearl necklace and stud earrings, as Thomas Heywood's 17th century heroine wore the lambent pearls of her own day. As the leader urges forward her chariot towards the third-term Conservative victory, which would in fact resoundingly be hers by the next day, the huge knives set in its wheels dominate the foreground of the picture. Meanwhile, sundry small male figures in chains from other political parties drag behind. Even Mrs. Thatcher's own recognizable jubilant supporters are tiny in stature compared to the dominant figure of the warrior queen. And that is the end of chapter 17. So we have one chapter left. Chapter 18, it's not even very long, but nature is calling. And I lost a tiny little cardboard box that had some value to me. I just lost it. I've been looking everywhere, so 323 to 335 is only 10 pages. I will do my best to get us read in as soon as possible, and we'll be able to mark this book off of our list of accomplishments. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate you. I know this was a very, very long one, but I have complete faith in your ability to watch part of it, put it on pause, take a smidgy break, and come back and do it again. Please like, please share, please comment. I appreciate comments too. Thank you for being with me today in my happy place. I appreciate you.